The new old world is here, with the official proper resurrection of Warhammer Fantasy. A process that has been quite some time in the making, as the original announcement now was years and years ago. But we are finally here with the Bretonnians and the Tomb Kings as two of the first starter box sets. And, well, honestly, I think it's an excellent choice. Warhammer has always struggled a little bit with just France but magical and just Egypt but undead. But these are still two of the more fresh factions, shall we say, in these regards, with quite a lot of unique lore to them. Obviously, it would have been better if one of them were the Skaven, duh, but still. Plus, neither one was ever much in the way of a meta pick, so it's a little bit of a fresh breath of air in that regard too. However, there are a couple of things surrounding this that I do want to talk a little bit about, because it's been a concern for a little while now, for quite some years in fact, that GW is beginning to lose a little bit of touch with their setting and their IP, or even that they are becoming a little bit too corporate and losing that care for the hobby that is so absolutely necessary to see it being maintained in a good fashion. Now, I think that the unnecessary murder of Warhammer Fantasy was one pretty big indication of that, as if they had simply given it the support they were then giving over to Age of Sigmar, there would never have been a reason to drag its screaming body out behind the shed and put both barrels in the back of its head to begin with, as Warhammer died primarily due to the fact that it wasn't receiving any support, rather than it being so utterly unflinchingly unpopular. And considering the fact that they are now bringing it back, well, that also seems to be a pretty strident indication that Age of Sigmar may not have been the financial success that Games Workshop were looking for, but details. So, let's talk a little bit about GW losing their way, or at the very least, potentially doing so seen from the perspective of an outsider. The Tomb Kings I have pretty much no complaints about whatsoever. They look great, they look exactly like I would expect the Tomb Kings to look, in large part because they haven't received all that much in the way of updated models either, but honestly, in an early relaunch, you don't really need to either. The Monarch of Nehekhara looks quite good, and the Lich Priest on Necrolith Bone Dragon, on the one hand, it does look amazing. No one will ever argue that Age of Sigmar doesn't have beautiful models. They've got some real stunning centerpieces, though I will say that it also does have a bit of a penchant for uselessly massive models, which this is one hell of a fantastic example of. I mean, so this is supposed to be a Lich Priest, right? That's the key core of this, the Lich Priest. This is the Lich Priest. He's about, 10% of the model. Everything else is just kind of enormo bloat. And again, don't get me wrong, it looks cool, but my god, there is a certain modicum of too much here, isn't there? Perhaps the best example of this is the Teclix model from a while ago, where Teclis, the actual character, makes up something like 20%, 50% being an enormous cat creature, and the remainder being tactical masonry. Yes, GW's fetish for strategically allocated pieces of rocks has only increased over the years of Age of Sigmar. Indeed, they feature prominently here as well, but now, rule of cool and all that, I don't mind over much. The Bretonnians, however, I do have a fair few complaints about, because I feel as if they are completely missing the point and the spirit of Bretonnia here. So, the Bretonnian Knights are all uniform colour. Now, anyone who's ever read the Bretonnian sourcebooks or ever had any interest in Bretonnia will know that this just does not happen. This simply is basically an impossibility. Like, this goes against every rule of basic Bretonnian society. Every single one of these guys, every last one of these Knights of the Realm, is a feudal lord in his own right. Each and every one of them has his own heraldry, his own colour schemes, his own castle, his own property, his own villages. Each one of these is a major noble. Like, the only equivalent of a minor nobility that might go into the service of other knights in Bretonnia would possibly be knights errants, and yet even then, they too have their own unique heraldry, usually based upon their family, of course, not all that embellished, but still, they will also have their unique heraldry. This is something that was demonstrated very well in the older box art from Bretonnia, where all of the knights, they have their own iconography, they have their own colours on the horses, etc. That was a large part of the reason why they were designed in this way, with the covers for the horses, so that you could paint them up any way you wanted. The fact that all of these guys are uniform, well, it makes no sense. You could argue that maybe GW wants to do this to, show off the army in a uniform fashion, but you are defeating the purpose of the faction by doing so. And it seems more likely that this is simply just a oversight or a moment of retardation on GW's behalf than that they, for some reason, got really lazy with painting the models. That doesn't make sense. They could even have brought out the old models, goddammit, It seems like a very clear and very obvious oversight. Now, the fact that the peasants have the same iconography, that's fine, because these are in servant of a particular lord. If you really want to be pedantic about it, you might have one regiment with one colour set and one regiment with another colour set, for example, sure. But the peasants, that's entirely okay. They would wear the livery of their master. And in the case of the Pegasus Knights, these are the old models. I am 98% sure these are just the old models with the old color schemes, and you can see they actually does have the unique heraldry. And like, why does this even matter, right? This could simply just be a simple oversight, an error, or a mistake. No. There's been too many of them. Like, this has gone back for years now, with one of the most famous examples, of course, being the 8th Legion Ultramarines, which might seem like a minor oversight, and in a vacuum it is, but it is just one of countless little errors that GW keeps making. And these are not errors that a hobbyist, that a fan would make. A fan would never confuse the 8th Legion, the Night Lords, with the 13th, the Ultramarines. There is simply no way. There is no way someone who's a fan of Bretonnia won't know that each one of these individuals is a feudal lord in his own right. And then there's also the Foot Knights, which are now officially introduced. Oh boy, the Foot Knights trigger me hard. So, there is an old unit of Foot Knights from 2nd, 3rd edition Warhammer Fantasy or something. It's quite old, which there is a unit, so it does have precedence, but even that specific unit mentions that they only fight on foot in extraordinary circumstances. If there is no other choice, if their horses are literally killed underneath them, only then will they choose, grudgingly so, having been deprived of all choice, to fight on foot. And it's not that it doesn't make in-game sense. It absolutely does. Bretonnia has always suffered from a lack of good, solid, dependable infantry, to the point that I know that quite a few people were using the bowmen as solid blocks of troops. No shit. Like, honestly, the men-at-arms are in many ways an inferior option to the bowmen, as the bowmen will be able to do some damage whilst the enemy closes, and then due to a nice and serious rank bonus, can stand up fairly effectively to enemy charges, whilst the knights maneuver around on the flanks to crush their foes or to break open the enemy's sides. So, it makes sense from a gameplay perspective, but it makes no sense from a wider universe perspective. And it makes no sense either from a faction perspective, is it? The Knights of Bretonnia were a very unique faction within Warhammer in that they were focused so heavily on cavalry that they received their own special lance formation. Now, the Bretonnians were never as good as they should be, frankly, and their balance was already a little bit wonky. They were very, very usually underpowered, I mean, especially when they came up against, assholes like myself, who simply fielded like 5 blocks of Skaven slaves. I was like, oh, you charged and routed a unit of Skaven slaves? Oh, congratulations. That was about 100 points. Now prepare yourselves to be flank charged by 3 units of clan rats. Not to mention a warp lightning cannon down the middle of that. But I'm deviating off the point somewhat. The point is, the Bretonnians would never have a formalized unit of foot knights. It makes no sense in the law, and it reduces their uniqueness on the tabletop. They are no longer a cavalry-focused, knightly chivalry-mounted army. They've got foot knights. They might as well just fight like the Empire now, but with even less uniqueness. Now they are just France with a touch of magic in that some of their horses are able to ignore difficult terrain. You've taken what was a very unique faction due to their extraordinarily heavy focus on cavalry and turned it into a pretty goddamn bland faction that is now blander than the Empire. At least the Empire still have that HRE roots in their focus on gunpowder weaponry and wacky engineering inventions. They've at least got that. Now, again, all the Bretonnians have is that some of their cavalry gets to ignore difficult terrain. That's it. You've even taken away their unique heraldry. They're just knights now. They're not Bretonnians anymore. And this does matter. This absolutely does matter. Because I'm sure you could argue that, oh, you know, it's just an aesthetic choice. Of course, you can paint them any way you want, and you absolutely can. But this comes from the company. This comes from the source. And if the creator of the faction cannot be bothered enough to acknowledge the faction's history, what hope is there for the faction? I want to remind you, neglect was the reason why Warhammer Fantasy died in the first place. And if the creators cannot even be bothered enough to look up the faction's background, what are the odds they're not going to neglect it again? What are the odds this will not be, well, essentially a short-term pump and dump, where they put out Warhammer Fantasy, sees how it sells, and then dump it right off the market again? Or worse still, simply tries to repeat the errors with Age of Sigmar. One of the main reasons why a lot of people are rejecting Age of Sigmar is because it is far too magical. It is far too absurdist high fantasy. Nothing matters anymore. When a storm of chaos hits the Empire, when Prague is under attack, that's a huge deal. If Prague falls, the civilized world lies open. In Age of Sigmar, like one of the first books I picked up was the Iron Jaws, I think, for the Greenskins. And it was talking about how chaos was sieging 1,000 cities, 1,000,000 fortresses, billions of armies marching across 100 plains. Like, okay, so does it matter if any of these fall? No! Okay, why should I care? You shouldn't! Oh, goody. Whereas Warhammer Fantasy is much smaller. It is much direct. When a city in Warhammer falls, it is a huge deal. When Altdorf is under siege, it is a massive, like, earth-shattering deal that could crush the entire empire. That is the focus that people like in it. And they've introduced far too much magic as well. One of the earliest units they introduced, for example, was the Kislevit, the Ice Daughter, whatever, so I've got the names now. I tried to look them up, put them in the video. And this is a way too high magic unit. They have magic weapons of magic ice. Even the high elves do not use basic units with magic weaponry. This is far too fantastical for Warhammer Fantasy, a far more grounded world. It would not surprise me if the other factions are eventually going to get the same treatment, because if Kislev already has magical ice weaponry, the nation with the least mages in it, being, because they only got really one Ice Mage, although that also has been somewhat retconned with other Ice Mages depending living in deserted monasteries and villages, etc. and such on, but still. Then what are the other factions going to look like? What are the elves going to look like? What's the Empire going to look like? Now this is going to be before the Age of Full Magic introduction, which makes it even weirder, the initial ideas of Kislev. I'm wondering if they'll just abandon those, or what the hell are they going to do with it, really? It's just, a lot of it seems weird. As if they're trying to turn back the timeline of Warhammer Fantasy and yet still push a lot of Age of Sigmar in there. I feel as if this was in many ways a little bit of an ill-thought-out plan, which seems weird considering how long they've had to do it, but again, I think it might be indicative of a lack of care and a lack of touch and connection to the IP. Now, I would love to be wrong on this, But let's be honest here, Arch is very, very rarely wrong on anything. So I suppose we'll have to wait and see, but Bretonnia does not give me a tremendous deal of hope that Games Workshop is the company that they once were, and that they are capable of bringing Warhammer Fantasy into the current year without bringing in too much current year, especially considering also there's a book being released, the first Warhammer Fantasy book for the release of Fantasy, where the author mentioned quite specifically that apparently in Bretonnia, people were going to have some ideas about better governance. Or who should govern, or who could be a knight? Are you telling me that we're gonna have a little bit of 21st century politics in feudal Bretonnia? I hope not, and I hope it'll simply maybe be a nod or a gentle appeal, like, oh, feudalism is a little bit sucky, we're taking a stand against feudalism, guys. Like, oh, very brave of you. very, very, very brave of you indeed. But it's one of those tiny little indications, and if we have learned anything from the last 10 odd years, it is that when you start to smell smoke, in all due likelihood, your ass is already on fire. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.